Hello and welcome to the Clark Road Barn Advisory Committee meeting for October 29th. This is our sixth meeting of this group, at least if I've counted correctly. And tonight we're going to be going through the conditions assessment report that was prepared by the consultant that was selected by the town board. And we'll, that conditions assessment was conducted by Torsha Structural Engineering and Design and KF Architects. The evaluation, and I'll just maybe before I dive into this, the report is a very detailed report. It was provided to the committee last week when we received that document, and we wanted to summarize sort of high-level findings and sort of observations so that even though you've all and the committee members have all had a chance to see it, for anyone who might be watching this at home now or in the future or is interested in it, we thought having sort of like a summary presentation might be helpful. So I apologize if this feels a little bit repetitive, but it just feels like a good opportunity for everybody to be on the same page who might not be part of this committee. The other thing I'll share is that, you know, these committee meetings are set based on the room availability and PCTV's availability, and so sometimes it doesn't work with the committee members' schedules. So for that, I would say, and I'll reach out to committee members in an email to reiterate this, but if anyone who can't make it to the meeting, they're not precluded from sharing feedback or comments or asking questions regarding this report. So that conversation can continue via email, and we can capture those, you know, follow-up communications in a subsequent meeting. The evaluation included several site visits by multiple team members. The last visit utilized a mechanical lift with a 60-foot arm for exterior investigations. Interior conditions in the building did not allow the use of that lift inside. There was no way to support it, and there was no reasonable way to get the lift to the basement without it being very costly. So the historic evaluation provided sort of an overview of the building. It looked at woodworking techniques and, you know, sort of estimated, again, there's no way to know this for sure, but estimated, you know, that the barn was likely constructed in the second half of the 19th century. They concluded that the loft might not have been original to the original construction of that main superstructure of the barn. And then they acknowledged that farmers of the time often built their own barns, and they were pretty skilled woodworkers as a result of that need to build their own structures, and often would happen over a period of years. They estimated or came up with a probable completion date sometime maybe in the late 1880s. And they provided a justification for why they could sort of land on that pre-1890 time frame. They provided an overview of the forensic methods that they used. Forensic seems like a very like medical terminology, but the you know, Phillips head, screwdriver, and hammer with marked increments, and I apologize, my computer is going to give me error messages. And then I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, so if I'm mispronouncing it, we can all correct me or somebody, but I'm assuming this is a Searchy char depth gauge. So those two approaches were used to evaluate the timbers and lumber and the sort of the building envelope materials, internally and externally, I should say. And we're just putting in some of the pictures that were included in the report. Obviously, there are a lot of photos in this report. This is just one example of the screwdriver being entered in into the roofing, and to show sort of that it gets buried in, and I'm going to have those sprinkled in here periodically for folks. Forgive me, that's siding is exterior, it's tongue and groove, vertical plank barn siding. They noted it's in very bad condition and it cannot be salvaged. The wide trim board and drip covers and sill beam at the base, and then the corner boards. Just in general, the exterior materials would need to be or not salvageable in their current condition. And that same holds true for that existing gambrel roofing, has extensive damage and would need to be removed and replaced. Sorry, I knew I had a repeat in there, I apologize. The basement and foundation walls is rubble stone north and west perimeter walls of the barn, plus the corner portions of the east end wall. They are fair condition and intact. The north wall, which is almost completely below grade, is damp, but in acceptable condition. The steel pipe beams are failing, and concrete block is in poor condition and would need to be replaced. Doors and windows in that would also need to be replaced, it was noted. And then there was a look at each of the interior floor levels. So starting in the basement, they noted the conditions and then things that would sort of need to be addressed. So the basement has a dirt floor, the basement's damp in places and may have flooded from time to time in the past. And then there's a thin layer of gravel that's been spread on the surface of some areas to help alleviate the dampness. Mitigation would be required. I think in the report, it was interesting to sort of understand how the barn structure was originally constructed and how it would have been utilized with hay and the manure and animals being stored in the lower levels. It sort of creates its own heat source. And so that was just really interesting to understand how and why these structures could survive during those early days with in how they're constructed. The basement mitigation would be required, and it's detailed in the report as far as what physical changes or modifications and repairs and replacements would be needed. And here are some pictures that demonstrate the current conditions in the basement. And they note evidence of dry rot on the wood surfaces, and they also show places where there's concrete infill and where there's block and how it meets the original stone. And this is one of the examples of, they noted that the steel beams in the basement were failing, and in this instance, it's punching up through the beam above it. On the first floor, the heavy timber superstructure of the barn on the main floor level up to the roof is fair to good condition. It could be repaired, rehabilitated. The first floor framing system over the basement is very poor condition due to basement dampness and constant race snow infiltration. Most of the north-south floor joists running over these support beams are in extremely poor condition. Replacement would be needed. And here are some examples and pictures that demonstrate the current conditions. And this is, again, showing the existing posts and noting the timber, sort of the intersection and cross beam. And then for the loft, which the report indicated that it's likely it was not original, just based on the materials used and I think the type of construction. The existing east end loft is in poor condition, similar to main floor level. The stair to the loft has recently collapsed and is pulling apart because of the instability of the main floor, and the floorboards and stairway would need to be replaced. And then this is a close-up of the underside of the collapsed stair. So as part of the analysis or this project, the consultant was asked to provide an overview of the current condition of the structure, and then to identify the potential repairs that would be needed to restore the structure. That process or that approach was broken up into two categories. One is temporary stabilization. What do you need to do right now to prevent the building from falling in on itself, essentially, or falling over, falling in, roof collapsing, any of those types of things. And so the report sort of outlined a series of steps that would be needed to do just that. And here you'll see on the screen the description of those steps that would be taken. So, retarping the entire roof, wrapping the barn sides with tarps, as well as leaving 2 high broken windows on each side open to allow the building to breathe. So wrapping it to the greatest extent practicable without having no ventilation. And I think one of the difficulties is, because of the fact that it's town-owned property, because it's an attractive nuisance, can't leave the building. I think if it was up to them, their preference would have been to leave the building sort of open if it could be, but that just is a liability that the town would not be. Michael, you can. Oh, is the name tag somewhere?
No. It was out.
It was up somewhere. Is it floating? Oh, maybe you're holding it? Oh, dear. Oh, well, you can, sorry, if you want to not put Bob's name up, that would be, but we had them all.
Yeah, I don't know what
Is it floating in front of someone by accident?
I thought I had it up.
Okay, we apologize. And it's not over there. Well, can you just check it's only one over there? Okay.
Over there, sorry.
I apologize. Michael, did you take it home the last time by accident, or do we usually have to collect these at the end? Oh, thank you, that's perfect. They, suggested, the town calling for utilities. I mean, just so you understand too, that the building doesn't have any, electrical service was available up to that barn building. But that service was being provided from a connection via the Clark House structure. That is not something that could be continued. So that service is going to be disconnected at the Clark House. So electrical service to the barn building would need to be done separately. The current connection could not be replicated or repeated to meet current code. And so there's some additional temporary shoring of the basement. And they provide a pretty detailed, take door off, do X, Y, and Z, and then put door back on. So there's like step by step. I'm just covering sort of the highlights here for the purposes of anyone who might be watching at home. And I'll also share that we are going to post both this just abbreviated presentation and the full report on the webpage. So anybody who's interested in taking a closer look can take a peek at it. Again, main level shoring is required to make sure that the load-bearing portions of the building will remain intact. And then they did note that the temporary shoring has to be installed by a professional shoring contractor, and it has to be designed by a New York State licensed structural engineer. And they provided an overview of costs. The report provides a detailed sort of cost estimate. And again, this is planning level cost estimates. And they gave a pretty wide berth as far as plus or minus 25%, because it's too hard to predict until you get into actual design and of what that's really going to entail. So the overall breakup, and this is just to stabilize based on the previous description, would be about $200,000. And one thing I need to confirm, and I'll verify this with the consultant, is whether or not the cost estimate utilized prevailing wage as part of their estimate. A lot of times construction estimators don't always factor that in, and so I'll verify that prevailing wage was taken into consideration. So that could maybe change this number. So then on to potential rehabilitation. So I think in a nutshell, the member frame of the interior, like the core of the structure, the timbers, can be dismantled and reused, but the siding, the roof, and the lower level basement would really need to be reconstructed, rehabilitated. Some pieces could be repaired in place. Others would need to be redesigned. So in the basement, it has to be excavated, new concrete footings for steel pipe columns would be needed, new slab walls on 3 sides of the basement, and replacement slab wall where the concrete block is currently. Waterproofing from the existing stone foundation, from the exterior, and then adding perforated drain piping along the perimeter of anything below grade, so that it's helping to keep water away from basement walls. Very similar to current design standards or practices. For the main floor, it's installing new wood floor joists and tongue and groove plywood floor deck over the new joist. That's not really a finished floor per se, but it would be structurally sound. The design of the main floor framing should include an opening for the construction of an access stairway to the basement. Timber frame posts, brace beams, and the eave beams supporting the rafters would need to be examined and repaired as needed. That south side eave beam needs to be replaced. Then the question becomes, if loft is to remain, you would repair the loft framing as required and then install new decking as well. And they're recommending a ship's ladder to the loft. I think right now, I don't know if that's different, there's like a traditional staircase. So the shipping ladder, I think, is more of a vertical up and down, like, I'm thinking bunk bed style, but that's just because that's, yes. Then on the roof, it's obviously dismantling the existing roof structure and rebuilding it to match the same profile and the same look and feel. And consistently throughout saying picking similar materials that have the same look and feel, so matching board widths, matching design. And then also adding insulation so that the building is more resistant to weather conditions as well. But it would not be conditioned space. In other words, you'd have insulation that would help, sort of the building deal with, changes in the temperature, cold weather, bad conditions, but it's not going to be conditioned. There's no utilities as far as water, sewer, or stormwater. And then other repairs to the exterior envelope is doing adding gutters, replacing the windows to match existing, using energy-efficient window units, and door window trim that matches existing in terms of style. It wouldn't be original material. And then repair the rolling door tracks and replacing those doors as well. And in the report, it provides a pretty detailed breakdown of cost estimates. Again, these are very planning level, just based on the size of the building and sort of known costs. And so this is a sort of the total that would be involved to restore the structure to a barn. And it also, just a couple of other notes that we added, the cost estimates are planning level only. And I know I've said that 4 times in the span of this meeting, but I'm going to say it maybe another time. Repair or enhancement of the existing site, meaning like the driveway, pathways, none of that was addressed. So as the parcel sits today, that previous cost estimate doesn't include addressing any of that. Modifications of the site, parking lot, any other amenities, utilities, adding utilities to the property are not also included in this evaluation or the cost estimates because it was beyond the scope. This is really truly a conditions assessment of the barn. And then they noted in the report, just based on the cost of repairing the structure, that if the town wanted to consider future uses and is, moving in that direction, it makes sense to know what those future uses are before you would engage the services of a design professional, because at almost $1 million or 1.2 shoring plus the restoration of the building, you'd want to know how much more you need to spend to bring the building to some final usable state. If you're going to spend $1 million, do you do that and then not have a plan for it, type of a thing? I think that was the gist of that comment. Also, that the intended use is going to impact what the design requirements are for any additional modifications to the building. Because then it's HVAC and building systems and sprinklers and all the things that you'd need to know how you're using the building to know what's required to retrofit it, if that makes sense. And I feel like I've done a ton of talking. So maybe I'll stop here and say, we sent it to you last week. It's only been a few days. So we're not expecting everybody to have gone through this document with a fine tooth comb or have, but if you have questions or comments or Carmen we could schedule another meeting. Carmen would be available if you had questions that were technical in nature that you wanted him to respond to. He just wasn't available this meeting was set, and, he was invited if he could attend, but he had a conflict. So we could schedule another meeting, and I can get dates from him if that's something that the committee is interested in. General thoughts?
I think it would be useful if Carmen, if you come speak to the details.
Okay. Everybody agree with that? I don't want, no offense, Tom, I appreciate your input, but is everybody else wanting an opportunity to ask questions directly?
Yeah, but I think we should come up with some questions, or talk, if we talk and come up with some kinds of questions, that might be good, so that we know we have enough.
And that's
Useful for him to.
Sure.
be ready and respond. Well, that's certainly something we can do, and so that you guys don't feel like you have to come up with those questions right now. You could start to have that conversation as a group. I think sometimes it's helpful as a committee to have that conversation happening live, but you also could say, oh, I thought of another question, or this is another detail I didn't understand or wanted more information about. And we could collect that and send it his way, and then find a date and time that worked for him.
I did have a couple of questions. One was that if the original use, keeping the more constant temperature was kind of a requirement of that structure, it sounded like, to keep it the hot-cold cycles, that how was that going to be mitigated, or how would it stand up if there weren't animals in there and things to keep it up over time? And so I know that there was a comment that you made around the insulation.
Yeah.
That maybe that would do it. And another is just sort of a high-level thought of, if it was rehabilitated, sort of how much of the structure that's there is kept through that process? Because we talked about the outside is changed completely, the roof is changed completely, some of the basement walls, so
The timber framing is the thing that would be
Pretty much.
really the original, the only thing that could be, I think, maintained and rehabilitated as part of whatever the new structure is my understanding. And if anybody read that report differently, but that was my takeaway, is that there's nothing that can be salvaged from the siding, nothing that can be salvaged from the roof members, or, I mean, obviously and also the way the roof was originally constructed was never meant to support, like, to have shingles on it. It wasn't designed, that's what people did, after the fact, 75 years later, somebody's like, well, no, we're going to put, shingles on the top of that. It's not meant to support that, and that's one of the reasons that the, failure can happen, is my understanding. Again, these are questions that Carmen can certainly address.
And then one more, that the floor would be, the primary floor at the front of it, the Clark House side, would be replaced for the first phase and then replaced again for the second phase? Is that my understanding?
I don't think it's going to be replaced. I think it was going to be shored up so that this member, I don't know if that's a great question. Let me clarify, that's a Carmen clarification.
Just plywood temporarily, and then
So people aren't, like,
stronger flooring would be the more permanent.
Okay, but the plywood, the first one was by a structural engineer to do it, so it
Yeah.
sounded like more than.
there might be some
my
there might be some,
I think that was for the heavy structure stuff. Yeah, some of the cross beams were pretty rotted out. And I had one question with respect to the tarps on the roof. I think we're on our third one already.
yep.
Are they proposing something that's a little sturdier?
Well, that I can find out if they have a recommendation. And again, somebody who does, shoring stabilization might have sort of a spec that they use or they design to. I think that at the time when the town was seeking proposals or folks that were available to do the temporary tarp, we were looking for somebody who was available and pretty quick turnaround, and so that's, we were, I think, going into if tarping the entire thing, if there was a spec that we could shoot for, then that's something we would be seeking through that design expertise. Any other thoughts or questions as you were reviewing the report that came to mind?
I came up with a couple things that I guess I would just say are things maybe to ask them about, because as I was reading through the report, my question when reading these things was kind of, why would that need to be done? One is just the waterproofing of the stone foundation. They talked about digging out on the exterior and putting a coating, a waterproof coating on. Generally, that's not a good treatment for a historic building, especially on masonry, because those coatings are not breathable. So it'll actually create a worse moisture issue for your foundation. So I guess I would be interested in learning a little bit more about what is that coating, how would that be done to make sure that we're not actually creating something it's meant to be a fix, but down the road it's actually not. So looking into that, I think along with that, the report also mentioned pouring a concrete floor in the basement, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I would also say, I'm not saying that the concrete floor would be a bad idea, but just making sure that how it's done is watched. Generally, you want to make sure that concrete's not poured all the way up to a stone foundation, because that can become problematic with moisture as well, and cause issues to the foundation. So you always want to pull it back and kind of have that interior drainage.
floating slab.
Yeah, breathability. And then the other thing that I was wondering about, and another question that might be good to hear from them, is if we're wrapping the building, and I think this is probably more step 2 during rehabilitation that this would happen. They recommended wrapping the building with Tyvek and using insulation beneath the new siding. And I guess my question would be kind of what is that for? And maybe it gets back to the point you were talking about, where before with the animals in there, it kind of helped with kind of heating and cooling on its own. So maybe that's the reason, but just kind of consider that. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad thing to do, except if you want to leave it looking like a barn on the interior, it won't look like a barn with Tyvek and insulation. So kind of how that happened. But also I think you'd have to be thinking to the future. If this is going to move forward as a rehabilitation, the barn will be used as something. Is it going to be used as a barn or storage? Then maybe that Tyvek and insulation isn't necessary. But if it's going to become something else where you would have a conditioned interior, then obviously that's something you would have to take a look at.
So it seems like they're not only the large frame timbers, but also as much of the masonry foundation would be kept, right? So that's.
I think that's what I was reading, but I wasn't completely sure about how much of the foundation they were trying to make poured concrete instead.
Well, I think the whole floor, because it's dirt basement now, they were saying excavating out the dirt basement floor and pouring concrete. And
Right, I think with the stone foundation walls, I know they were
walls.
talking about doing, I think where it's concrete block now, they were talking about removing that and having that as a poured concrete foundation in those areas. But I'm assuming they were talking about keeping the stone foundation where it is.
I think they were.
Yeah.
They were. And replacing the concrete blocks on the south side, because they're falling, they're
Right.
split.
I was going to say, I would have to look at it again, the report more closely, to determine whether that was the recommendation, but we can certainly get that clarification from the engineer. Thank you for those questions. We appreciate it, and I hope someone, because I'm definitely not taking notes, so thankfully we record these and we can always go back and get people's comments. I think the other, this is the maybe the tricky part for the town board is wanting, thoughts and recommendations from this group about the, what the potential path forward could be. I'm also hearing but this group isn't in charge of deciding, so does the town need a barn, or what other type of facility could this be converted to? And I think that question has not been explored at all, and I'm not sure if, so this is feels like a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, if I'm being honest. I think from a facility standpoint, a historic barn structure doesn't provide a lot of storage capacity or storage ability for the town's purposes in terms of equipment. It's not located in a site that's easily, it's, again, without doing any other major improvements. It's a small driveway, a small parking area, limited sort of mobility to and from the site as it sits currently. So I think we'd have to have maybe more conversations, and maybe this committee could be sort of some thoughts about if A, then do B, if B, then, something like a little bit of a, to the town board, maybe a choose your ending, essentially. But I know the town board is also, just so you know, has received the copy of the full report, and they're looking forward to this committee's thoughts and input on, sort of what to do next. The conditions report was really, and the conditions assessment was really a critical next step in order for you guys to even have like an idea. And I think, Mike, it was you that said, how do we know what we should suggest if we don't know how much it's going to cost to do even like the basic stabilization?
But I think this is really useful because it gives us kind of an estimate, and however whatever uncertainty there is in that.
A framework.
What the minimum path would be to even just keep the barn there.
Right. Yes. And keep the barn there, and just to be clear, not be accessible or usable by anyone in the public. And we have to determine as town, departments, is there any use for it as a barn structure only if it was restored? So I think those are some of the questions that we have to be mindful of, or just think about and say, and I think, did anybody have sticker shock? $1 million seemed like a big number to me. Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by anything these days, but.
I mean, where would we discuss, what the town can take advantage of in terms of grants, public-private partnerships, and that kind of thing? Because I think that's an important path to go down and explore if, as part of a moving forward.
So that could be a recommendation from this committee if you had wanted to explore. I mean, funding opportunities are limited, potentially for, I shouldn't say limited, but for municipal historic preservation. Maybe, Megan, you might have insights that I don't, but from the funding sources I'm familiar with, it leans toward the private investor or developer benefiting from the investment in the historic property, with tax credits and grant programs to help offset some of those upfront costs. I'm not sure if there's similar.
Yeah, there are, at least in the preservation world, a lot of the grants that are out there are typically more for nonprofits and municipalities. The problem is, and the thing that a lot of us don't like, is that a lot of those grants aren't for capital projects. So they could be used on things like a conditions assessment or paying for your architect to do drawings and those types of things. There are very few grant programs out there that are where the funding can be used for the actual capital brick and mortar work. There is one that is in its second year, coming out of the Preservation League of New York State, so they're the statewide preservation nonprofit organization. And they just started this last year, and it's called the Preservation Opportunity Fund, which it might not work in our favor this year just because letters of intent are due on Monday, on November 4th, so this coming Monday. And I will say the other thing with these grant programs is that they're very competitive. So while I wouldn't say the town shouldn't try for them if and when it's the right time or if they decide to move forward, but just being aware that those grant programs that are out there are pretty competitive, so it's not a guaranteed thing. I'm trying to think what other grant programs might be out there for this type of thing. That's one that I recently have become aware of and have been letting a lot of people know about because there really aren't bricks and mortar type grants out there. But I'm wondering if from other state agencies, if there's anything this might fall within, like if within the agriculture, all of that, if there's anything there that could be explored. That's just a little outside my expertise.
Sure.
But,
I mean, the funding just in general is typically it's, some programs are, like you said, aimed at doing soft costs, and it's offset. It's not paying for it entirely. It's a match of some sort. So the town would there'd still be a monetary contribution, even with a grant, obviously. But we can certainly look at those. We did some, I think at one of the past meetings, we talked about like through the CFA, that's New York State Consolidated Funding Application, there might be some program, and we can certainly, talk with some of the state agency reps to find out, like, here's a barn we have, is there anything that's out there that this would fall under? The other thing I would say is from an RFP standpoint for the public-private sort of, that's certainly something that could be a recommendation too, to gauge the market to see, is there, I think we'd have to, work with our town attorney to even understand if that's a possibility, or how it's structured in a way that protects the town. I do know that this is, I don't have a lot of information, but I have some awareness of the fact that there was an RFP that was issued years ago for the Clark House, with that same idea to see if somebody else wanted to make the investment and renovations in the property and then be able to have a long-term lease. And the costs were prohibitive. So a developer couldn't make they'd have to own the property to get the tax base. So I think that's the other thing too. The town could issue an RFP to see who wants to buy it to rehab it. That's always an option. And that'd be a stipulation for the transaction, that it's got to be somebody who wants to, rehab the structure and reoccupy it or repurpose it. So an adaptive reuse, if you will, in the private marketplace.
I mean, one of the things that I really liked about this report is that it gave us information about that barn in terms of, when it was built, which I don't
Yes.
think that we really knew that. Did we know that it was 1880s or?
I mean, and that's a guesstimate, I think, or an estimation on their part, just based on the style of construction, the condition of the beams, the fact that they were milled and not hand sewn. So I thought that was really interesting information, and just even also the way those barns were constructed over the period, like that the foundation and the frame might have been constructed at one point in time, and then it took another 5 to 15 years to build the rest of it.
Yeah. That's good information.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have lifts back then, so I don't even know.
Yeah, right.
Just engineering marvels of the past. Mike, did you have some questions or thoughts?
Yeah, well, one just to tie on to that last, the dating of the barn to the later 19th century based on the water-powered saw marks a little bit ignores the fact that, Daniel Penfield and right on Rondequoit Creek had sawmills. So, in fact, the sawn timbers of this might date earlier and might have been sawn right here in Penfield.
Yeah, hard to know for sure, but yeah.
I've always, again, going back to one of the biggest questions I think to face is, what is the future use? How do we envision this space benefiting the larger Penfield community? And I guess I've always thought one of the problems we're wrestling with is the barn is in an inconvenient location without parking lots and accessibility, whereas right across the street we have enormous parking lots and we have several pre-existing large cleared areas close to the Clark House. So I guess I had two questions. What is currently the status of the lodge that the town is constructing behind the Clark House? And also, what are the plans for the flat one-story shed-like building that I think the golf course had all of their golf carts in and might just simply be town storage now? I don't even know the use of that building.
So I can share with you updates to both of those questions. The Clark House renovation project is at the 95% construction drawing phase. That will be being brought to final 100% documents within the next few weeks, and the project will go out to bid. And then the bid results will be shared with the town board at a future meeting to review the costs, the proposed costs of the renovation. All the certificates of appropriateness associated with the project have been issued. So really, we're at the point where we're about to go out to bid and get the construction actual costs. The cart barn is included in that project, and there are some minor renovations to, I think, the exterior structure where there was a little bit of a damaged wall. The building was loaded for bear with electricity. That's not needed because we're not charging carts anymore, but it would be used for cold storage. And that's how it's being used currently, and Tim
Yeah,
actually can
Yeah,
address
it's
that.
currently used as cold storage. That's where we store our amphitheater and all the piping in the wintertime when we take that down. There's equipment there that we use constantly over at Shadow Pines for the disc golf course and now the new pickleball and playgrounds, more on-site stuff, and more storage for, disc golf baskets and anything else. Right, and we have a bunch of tires from the DPW, since a lot of our storage is over there during our construction.
Okay, so that cart barn has long-term, that's going to be
Yes.
for a while in the
Yep.
size. So just kind of thinking these things through, right now we have a less accessible barn on the south side of the road, and we have a large parking lot and a lot of foot traffic and a lot of accessibility on the north side of the road. So, and it seems from the report that the heavy framing of the barn, which is, I think, the real gem of the structure, is really, really sound. And I think the report said that at least the north half of the roofing system is also in very good shape. I think the report said 75% of the south side of the roof needs to be replaced, largely because of sort of our own self-induced damage there. But it seems a lot of the expense comes from replacing the wooden floor and replacing a cellar-level area that is probably never going to get used substantially. So it's replacing it for the sake of historically reenacting the space. To me, it sounds like maybe to both save a large cost of expensive work on the barn below the sill might be simply to take the very valuable and historic frame and move it to the parking lot across the street and put it, if you're going to build a whole new concrete slab frame, why not do it in a much more convenient, accessible location and move the barn there? And then by putting it on a newly built frame set to receive it, you can already be placing the piping, the electricity, all of the modern amenities that would go to having frequent public use of the barn, and bring it there next to the parking lot where all the Frisbee golfers and the town as a whole could be using it. And if you are simply going from the sill up, replacing the wooden floor and working on the cellar beneath it, which is the vast majority of the costs, are eliminated. It's kind of radical, moving part of the barn to a much more usable, publicly accessible place, but leaving, abandoning, therefore, the historic footprint that it once had, but that historic footprint was primarily to house cattle, which the town is no longer in the business of.
And the town has never been in the business of housing cattle, just for the record. But yes, to your point, that's how it was used when it was first constructed, and we certainly don't have cattle we're going to keep there. Couple of thoughts, or just things to be sort of aware of. I don't know where on the property you're imagining. There is a master plan for the property that we'd have to sort of revisit and take a look at. There's also a restriction in the deed for construction, and that was a term of the sale from Dolomite to the town. There's a 200-foot buffer from the property line where no new structures can be placed. And in fact, with the Clark House renovation, the proposed project reconfigures the parking and some things to move things further away from that property line, so that it really is respecting the 200-foot buffer. So there's a buffer component that we'd have to take into consideration. Just that's important information to have. I don't want, as people are imagining in their minds where it could go, that's an important factor. I mean, certainly these are things that, again, this committee is going to be asked to provide some type of a memo, sort of here are some things that we want you to think about as a committee. Each of you, what are your thoughts and your preferences? And I think to the extent, we're here as town staff and we're on the committee to provide information. To the extent that some of us are town residents, but I don't think we're wearing our town resident hat. We're really playing staff liaison or staff providing information. So I think we'd be looking really to the resident committee members to give us some thoughts about, what the direction should be or what considerations. Ultimately, it's the town board has to decide what step to take next, but they want to have this committee's input before moving forward.
Yeah, and I think from the recreation side of things, as I put not my resident hat on, and my recreation hat on, but I know as we look at Shadow Pines with the north side itself, if the Clark House is being looked at as a potential lodge, that amenity being out to the public, it kind of ties back into what's the purpose for the barn. And it going to the north side, we have an open shelter at the other north side of it, which is going to be rentable to the community, has bathrooms and things like that. I think when we've looked at our Parks and Rec master plan, that's going to be in front of the board as the last year of our lives, kind of planning for that. We kind of looking at the south side of that property in general of, what's going to be out there. We certainly have the Shadow Pines plan, the original
plan.
Moratorium plan, thank you. But you look at that south side and the trails and openness is something like this barn that might not have the AC, electric, things like that. Would that might be a better fit on that south side of the property, whether the same size or refurbished to an open shelter down there that's a little more quaint and, people can walk by and use it, stuff like that. So I think coming from the recreation side of things, that's things that we've heard on that south side needing some sort of a shade structure or the ability to rent a lodge on that side to walk the trails with even potential multi-use trails on that side too. So just wanted to put that side in there. I know the north is wonderful to have the Clark House and all those things, but the south side too is, I think, another great place that people explore.
Just a question of clarification. Does that, whatever you said, does that mean the barn stays in its current footprint?
Not necessarily. I think if we were talking about taking it down and moving it,
Okay.
I'd look to say, is there other opportunities on the south side that might be used a little bit differently than a lot of the things that have gone on the north side that, if the Clark House gets rehabilitated and changed, there's bathrooms, there's that kind of rentable structure. The north side has pickleball, playgrounds, things like that. The south might be more custom for a less of an amenity type structure that the public can use.
But in that concept of sort of moving some or all of the existing structure to reconstruct it as a barn, or just to recover that wood as historical wood, rebuild something useful for the town,
Yeah.
and do some kind of historical presentation that, because I think some of the things I said about the beams and things of this nature and how they're constructed is educational. I mean, that could be educational. So you could take that material, restructure it into another purpose,
Sure.
and keep the members visible enough that you could use it for historical information purposes. I mean, that's
Sure.
Right.
an idea.
These are all the ideas that this is why this meeting is happening, so that you as a group can talk about these things, decide which, and I think the other thing, and somebody else stop me because if you think this is not accurate, but I don't know that you have to come to a conclusion or to an answer for the town board. You could come up with a series of options or exploration for the town board to consider. And, and if you wanted to have sort of like your ranking of or everybody's individual votes on what you thought was the best. I mean, those are the kinds of things that could be helpful. I think that's similar to what how it was done with the original moratorium committee, and I can speak to that because I served on it. And so we had a, prior, like, option 1, this is our top choice, it should be this, and if you're not going to do this, then this would be option number 2. So you could have a series of potential solutions or options for the town board to consider. If you feel really strongly and there's, unanimous sort of feeling or consensus, then you could say, this is what we think is a good idea, and then the town board can take that, marinate on it, decide, how to proceed, globally to moving on to next steps.
If I think back to the proposal that Torsia, we eventually got accepted, I think they had done some barn moving in their past. And I wonder if they could give us a quick idea of what, very round numbers. Is it $500,000 to move it across the street, or?
Well, I think you'd be moving the members, like the timber members
Sure.
over, and then everything else is sort of getting built up around it. But
Yep.
I don't know if at this stage, having completed their report, but I can certainly ask if they have like just a off-the-cuff
Yeah.
sort of estimate, or how much the price changes. And I think, Michael, to your point of if you're not having to restore the basement, what does that change? But if you're adding utilities and designing those mechanical systems, is it the same? Is it different? Is it more? I think the challenge with a project like this, especially with the conditions assessment that sort of says this is what it would cost to rehab what's there, once you start asking, well, what if we did this? That's a different project and that's a different scope. So we have to just be sort of mindful of that too.
But if that was the goal, how would that, like, $200,000 initial, I forget the term.
The
shoring or
stabilization.
Stabilization,
Yeah.
right? Does that need to be done or something if you're going to take it apart
Essentially
and keep just the
dismantling it,
beams,
yeah.
or something?
I think that could be another follow-up question for Carmen. So if, like, say the committee felt strongly about some other variation where the timbers were going to be preserved and either used elsewhere or used at the same location, what would the recommendation be? Like, how do you proceed to do that now? And maybe do you skip the shoring and stabilization if it's not staying in place?
And are there even more immediate things on tarping or other things, right?
Sure, yeah.
So that was going to be one of my questions. What's the current ticking bomb for this thing to fall over?
Well, I don't think anybody is going to stamp a plan that says that, because that's a prediction that no engineer is going to be willing to stake their license on.
My point being is, how much time do we have to make a decision? I think because we're in a sort of situation where if we're going to stabilize it, we need to stabilize it. So is
Yeah.
that the first decision the town board has to make, and are they willing to put that kind of money into it? Because
Right.
if they're saying, no, we can't do that, continue, well, by the time we do all the other reviews and assessments and discussions and voting, we're losing something, all right? So I don't know this town board enough to know their appetite or the budgetary constraints to say, if they looked at the $200,000, is that already a no-go position?
I'm so sorry, I have to just stop. I don't know if somebody is like, the TV is
Yeah,
kicking back
I
and
think
forth,
I'm
so I just
touching
want to make sure that we don't have a malfunction here in the middle of the meeting.
So I
thanks,
just don't
Michael.
know, I'm a little quiet because I don't know the town board enough to get a sense of these things are just already out of the picture, or they're willing to do something.
So, yeah, that's a question I can't answer either. I mean, I think that if, certainly I can share that question with the town board and, sort of get a sense of where they are. I think my understanding from, talking to a couple of town board members is they were anxious to hear sort of this committee's thoughts and what, your reaction to the report and to what you think maybe potential recommendations or next steps would be. Because I don't think the town board, commissioned this committee to get that type of feedback. So they don't want to jump ahead and then start making decisions without some feedback from this committee. I think what we could do as like a very next step is find a time and day. Now, here's a question for you. I know that Carmen and his team, evening meeting might be a challenge. He was asking about, like, is late afternoon an option? Could we do this as a Zoom, if that made sense for the purposes? I don't know if that's allowed or not allowed I think it is, because we're not a board, we're not an appointed board, but I can find that out. Or if he could be available via Zoom, I don't know what it is, but I'm going to check his availability in the next few weeks and not wait a month, but would that make sense? Could people come here for a 4 or 4:30 meeting? Is that doable? And if it's not, it's okay to say no. I want to be respectful of everybody's time.
Not on a Tuesday.
Not on a Tuesday. Any other, okay, we can know that. So what I might do is ask Carmen to provide for me some dates and times in the next few weeks, late afternoon, and we can, if everybody can be here physically, I think in person would be wonderful, and so we can make those arrangements. And we'll get another meeting on the books so that you can have questions and more details that we've raised at tonight's meeting, and then that might give you more information to start to assemble some thoughts and feedback.
I would also throw in, I think at our very last meeting, which was a while ago, this committee had talked about, maybe it wasn't the last meeting, it could have been the meeting before that, about doing a conditions assessment versus, a feasibility study. And I think I kind of walked through what those differences are and why you would do one over the other. So because I don't sit on this committee as a committee member, I sit on it as a preservation advisor. I guess the other thing I would say to all of you is consider whether or not you might want to ask the town board to think about doing a feasibility study at some point. Because again, saving the barn doesn't necessarily have to mean that I know ideally it would be a town amenity that would be there for the public to use. But if that wasn't an option, if the town just didn't have a use for it, would this committee and would all of you be open to recommending other things? And what would those other things be? I think, Kerry, you had mentioned, even putting out an RFP to see what some interest might be. And that might be an RFP process to see what other interest outside of the town could be. And having a feasibility study kind of done together might help steer where this could go as well. Because, right now we're hearing that the condition of the barn, most of it's in pretty bad condition. We can salvage the superstructure of it. So you're looking at, if you're really looking at kind of a rehabilitation / reconstruction, which are two different things, but this is kind of melding the two together. So if we're saving this barn, you're really going to have the structure left that's historic. The rest of it would not be a historic barn. So that's the first thing to understand, is it would be new construction. So, would it be important to have it sitting on its current foundation in order to kind of retain that historic appearance and what it was? And I think a lot of that will play into, as we've all been talking about, what is it going to be? Is it going to be a barn? Is it going to be something the town can use? Is it something that, I don't know, someone opens a gift shop in, or a studio where they work out of something? And, a lot of that, you could make all the recommendations you want to the town board and they can think those things through, but I think without a feasibility study, ultimately, you're just kind of throwing darts at a board about what it could be.
Yeah, so Megan, maybe if you want to give some thoughts, a feasibility study, what's the going rate, maybe range for one of those? Because I think that's going to be another sort of consideration, and for the town board's perspective of if ultimately, for example, if ultimately the decision is made to RFP or to try to see if there's private interest in utilizing the barn and it's at location, is it, where would the
cost with that?
Yeah. So how does that, there's no cost to issue an RFP. That's a free and easy thing to do. I think the feasibility study be helpful for the town board to understand a cost parameter.
Right, and that I am not sure of off the top of my head, but could definitely find out and bring that back to everyone next time we meet. And it might be that doing the RFP process first might be a good start to that feasibility, because then whoever ends, if there is a feasibility study done, whoever's doing that kind of has a running start, because they know what some of the interest may be already, which is something they wouldn't necessarily have to do as much of as part of that feasibility study process. But I can definitely find out.
Okay. All right, so a couple action items. We're going to set another meeting and have Carmen and/or members of his team join us so they can address questions. It sounded like most of the questions were technical in terms of like physical condition, like improvements. So if I think it's going to likely be Carmen himself that would be participating with us in this meeting. If he thinks anybody else is going to join him, the more the merrier. But at this point, I'm imagining just Carmen would be the one in attendance more than likely. But I'm not saying that, not for sure. So we'll do that. And then I think that I'm going to reach out to the committee as a whole. I'm copying everyone, so even if you were here, I'm just going to sort of like remind folks they can watch the meeting and see the discussion. If anybody has questions about the report that they would want to have addressed at our next meeting, to please share those with me. We've captured the ones that have been, the royal we, not me, have captured the questions that have been raised here tonight, so we'll relay those to Carmen in advance so he can come sort of prepared. And then we'll go from there. And then I think at some point, I don't know, I'm not going to assign anyone, but at some point, someone's going to have to volunteer to sort of take the lead on, outlining the recommendations or the thoughts or some type of a capturing of where the committee is. And if there's consensus, great. If there's not consensus, that's okay too. You can just describe that. So, at some point.
I think at some point, before too long, the committee itself has to come to some recommendations on, like, what would it really be used for? Because it seems like the point we're at is we have to take some action really soon by this recommendation, right? And that would involve spending maybe on the order of $200,000, right? That, seems to me like that's kind of questionable to do that if we don't yet have any real ideas as to what the goal is. Is it to save the history? Is it to open a business? Is it to, whatever it is, to have another recreation area? I think I would think that it would be important for us to come to some kind of direction there, or a couple of directions to kind of update this. Otherwise, I think we're kind of just defaulting to what this plan, what this report would be, which is to keep it as a barn and have it sort of not be really useful maybe for much, unless you did the additional work to find out how you would want to do it for a purpose. And, even to get to the point of exploring that too much, we would have to invest presumably the couple $100,000 to even get to the point where we would have that luxury of doing that and still saving something. So
right.
I think we should plan somehow our course to come to some at least range of options that we think are within the scope of what we would recommend.
Sure. And what I think, and maybe what we can work on as a staff is maybe coming up with sort of a collection of questions that each of you could sort of individually answer that gets to that point of the sort of what will we use this for, or what are we doing, and that maybe that might help drive that conversation toward a conclusion of some sort, or some closure of, okay, we've reviewed this, we've got the conditions assessment, here are the things that we're thinking, and how do we sort of essentially tie it up in a bow and maybe not a pretty bow, maybe it's a big, it's got many directions, but that you're bringing something back to the town board, food for thought or
I would think it would be important for the
recommendations.
town board for them to know if they were going to decide to spend $200,000, right, or not,
and
that they would at least have some ideas of these are the kinds of things that might be done with it, right?
Right. Well, I will say that to date, I don't know that there's been any discussion about the potential uses of, like, there have been, up until now, and maybe this committee would have some recommendations, there have not been an identified use of the structure. If it's, could it augment cold storage? Potentially, you know what I mean? So it could maybe, so that's something that DPW would have to explore, or facilities. But I think then becomes a cost benefit. So could the town achieve cold storage somewhere else for a lot cheaper? And is that the best use of of a form, a facility. So I think those are the kinds of things ultimately the town board has to decide. But I think to your point, Mike, having some framework for here are some of the imagined possibilities or things that we think might be feasible to look into, and then go from there. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking in circles.
Well, that whole property was voted on by a majority of Penfield residents to save, including the house and the barn. So I feel like, that the mandate to save those structures is there. And I would love to see the mindset around it being that it's an opportunity. It is expensive, and it is, not in great shape, partly because it's been sitting there for 10 years with no protection. But, it's part of our history, and the Penfield, residents of Penfield have said, a majority have wanted, that they want that to stay. So I just
Yeah, I
want
think when
people to remember that that's why we even have those buildings.
Yeah, just so you know, I think the buildings we had no choice. Those buildings were purchased separately and not included as part of the bond. And we could not buy the rest of the land without buying the structures.
Right.
And we were not allowed to examine their condition prior to purchase, is my understanding. So it was an as-is sale. And so I think just for the public to be aware, in order to buy the land and acquire that property, the structures.
People could have voted no on buying the house and the barn, though.
No,
They were
they
two
were
different
separate?
ballot
Yeah, and-
efforts.
Oh, forgive me. Oh, forgive me.
Both of those.
Yeah.
Okay, true.
They could have voted
Separate
no.
issues.
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
vote.
Okay, thank you. I was, obviously, I remember voting. I don't remember reading the ballot, so that's terrible.
Real quick, so there was 2 ballot questions, and both had to be yes for the whole project to go through.
Right. And how many people came out? 7,000 people voted yes for it? Wasn't it something like that? It was more voters than any sort of special election in Penfield.
Could you find that, Kerry? I'd be
I can-
interested to see what that was, because I don't remember specifically.
Yeah, I can certainly find it. Yeah, I'd be happy to do
Maybe send it
that.
out to us, thank you.
Yeah, happy to do that. Now I need to do it for my own recollection.
Yeah.
So I'm not disagreeing, I wasn't here, so I don't disagree with that, but it was the mindset, well, we really want the property, but we've sort of been forced that we have to take the buildings as well to get the property, because if we don't do that, we get nothing.
I believe so.
And so I can see that to be a good motivation, fine, we'll take the property, because I really want the land, versus I really want the buildings, the land comes with it.
But each voter might have had their
Responsibility
own
of stewardship
Yeah,
is
yeah.
none of
view on it,
us.
so.
Yeah.
Right.
But
And
he-
it is a town landmark,
yeah.
so.
Yeah, the Clark House is a town-designated landmark, although it had been, at the time it was designated, I think it had already been modified several times over with the additions in the 30s and then other addition in the 80s. But I'd have to go through my memory book on that one as well. So I know that was all explored as part of the certificate of appropriateness. But
But it's still a landmark.
yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's being preserved as part of the Clark House project. Yeah.
And so, not to get too far ahead, it may be a situation where if the town board is agreeable to large expenditure, the citizens are going to have to weigh in on that funding somewhere, somehow.
We'd have to explore sort of
Right,
how,
I know that's
that we might be getting way, way down the road there, but yes,
10 years past, they may have a different view
yeah.
about whether it stays or gets reconstructed. I'm not trying to take away the
Would the historic board,
importance of
have to be consulted as part of the barn at all? or
No.
No.
It's been deemed, yeah. That's not required. Right, that's the.
Right, yeah, no, the barn is not designated, so
Yeah.
it's not part of the consideration of the Historic Preservation Board, just the Clark House.
But one of the things that the Torsia report said was that by being a part of the property, the Clark House property, it is in itself part of that landmarks
Yeah, I think
designation.
their report does say that the barn is designated.
It's not. We checked.
I was wondering
But I
about
like,
that.
I
Yeah.
appreciate
I missed that part.
Yeah, I missed that part too. So I have to, and I read the thing from cover to cover, but I guess I must have skimmed.
It was long.
It was.
No, we checked that back when we were looking at the Clark House, when we were starting the whole lodge project. We looked at what parts of it were actually part of the designation and what was not, and it was determined that the barn is not part of the designation.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on, it seems that there's ongoing damage because of the holes in the roof, and I think somebody mentioned we're on our third set of tarps. With basically those holes still there and water damage still occurring, it seems putting a fourth tarp is not learning from the first three that failed. And I was wondering about, I guess there's an awful lot of metal roofs with, basically thin metal sheathing on commercial houses, and it seems that overlaying the holes in the roof with a metal roof sheath on at least a temporary arrest the continued damage basis would solve the problem of buying us more time alongside the stabilization. Because, yeah, I think it's an immediate need to at least keep more damage from continuing. And I guess I'd like a question of, clearly the plastic tarps are just not doing the job. We've seen that. Can we put metal over the holes, which is going to be a much more durable and waterproof answer to our current problem?
So that's a question we'll also direct to Carmen. He and his team have been up there and will be able to give some guidance as to whether or not that's a feasible option in terms of, do you have something to nail it to, or to affix the metal? And certainly we can, if it's determined that that's an option, we can go look at pricing and see what that would entail.
Yeah.
It can't hurt to get more information.
Companies do metal roofs.
Yeah.
Have the stock, I think, 20-foot sheets.
Yeah, we can certainly
Overlap them.
we can see if, I think the other, again, not everyone that does that kind of project does prevailing wage work. So a lot of companies that do specialize in certain types of construction and might do that on a very regular basis for commercial and residential applications will not provide a quote for municipal work because of the prevailing wage requirement. So just to share that, so that just to manage, it's not something that everyone out in the world knows is why prevailing wage is a thing. And so I'd just like to share that. All right, so I will be in touch with some emails. We will establish another meeting date and time that Carmen can attend. We'll shoot for a late afternoon time frame. PCTV can hear me. I'll be asking them for the availability of this room and their time. So I would say stay tuned. And as I mentioned, continue to forward any additional questions that pop up as you're looking at the report. If something else pops into mind, this is not a speak now or forever hold your peace moment. And I'll be reaching out to the members, to the committee as a whole, and encouraging anyone who wasn't here to share their thoughts and feedback, if they had any, with us via email, so that we can prepare sort of a consolidated list of questions and seeking clarification from Carmen. This way we can really maximize his time with this group. Did I miss anything? I'm looking to Matt and Aimee to tell me if I've missed something. Okay, perfect. All right, well, it is, I have to look at the time. It is 6:46, and I will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you all.